Well, you can be seated this morning. Thank you all so much for being with us at Evangel Temple. I'm telling you, I wouldn't miss. This is my job, so I don't have much of an option in it, but I'm just saying, even if it wasn't my job, I'd still be here because, the Lord's moving. People are getting saved when we're taking up the offering, and it's just, it's a pretty amazing thing that we're experiencing. And it's nothing that we can manipulate. I hope you understand that. It's just the hand of God. And so, if you've got friends and family members and coworkers that you're talking to, don't be afraid to talk to them about Jesus. And just, if you're not sure what to say what Jesus said. Come and see. It can honestly, why do you go there? What's going on? Well, just come and see. Come and see. And it can be really, really powerful. So we are finishing our sermon series on the parables of Jesus. Some of you thought that we wouldn't get to the end of it. Well, there's a lot of parables, so it's taken a minute. For those of you that are really astute observers, you will realize that we actually never in this sermon series talked about the parable of the prodigal son. And if you're wondering, how in the world can you do a sermon series on the parables of Jesus and not talk about the parable of the prodigal son? The reason why is because earlier in the spring, we did an entire, I think it was a 5-week sermon series just on the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. So there was no point to, there wasn't anything that we didn't already cover that we would cover in 1 week there. So if you want to know more about the parable of the prodigal son, go back and get that. It's on our app. It's on Apple Podcast and Spotify and YouTube. All of the stuff that we're on, it's on there. And so if you want to know more about that particular parable, it's out there, and we encourage you to get it. Or to get the book by Timothy Keller, The Prodigal God, and you'll find out all that you need to know about that. So if you were thinking, he's been saving the prodigal son for the last week, nope, because we did it earlier. This week, we are going to examine the parable of the rich fool, the parable of the shrewd manager, and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And money is an interesting topic. I have always been amazed that we can discuss almost anything in church, but the minute we preach about money, we're accused of meddling and being overly concerned with finances. Well, the church is just after your money. I can see the comments on our live stream right now. I knew it. But Jesus dealt directly with the issue of money. He was not afraid to talk about it. Scholars estimate that 1 out of every 10 verses in the Gospels directly address financial issues. So Jesus obviously knew how important it is that we have a proper understanding of money. And it's interesting, the way people feel about money hasn't really changed in a couple thousand years. The religious leaders of Jesus' day interpreted the promises of Deuteronomy 28 as primarily material blessings for obedience. They viewed material possessions as a sign that God was blessing their lives. And so when they thought of the blessing of God, they thought of stuff. They thought of money or land or things like that. And some things never change. Today, we have so-called Christian leaders who are teaching a false gospel that they call the prosperity gospel. And it's exactly like the idea that the religious leaders lived by in Jesus' day. And that should actually be our first warning sign. If it's pretty much what Jesus was dealing with, then it's probably something that we should be leery of. And according to the prosperity gospel, the closer you are to God, the more it is reflected in your banking accounts. And if you're really holy and righteous, you should have all kinds of stuff. God shows you how much He loves you by giving you all kinds of stuff. And if you're not rich, it's because you don't have enough faith to just name and claim the money that God has waiting for you. And this way of thinking is such a poor understanding of what the Bible teaches about money. And if you're not sure about what prosperity preachers say, I'm going to give you, this is my all-time favorite quote by a prosperity teacher, and I won't give their name because I don't want you to go out and buy any of their junk. But this is a direct quote. This is my all-time favorite prosperity preacher quote. Okay, you ready for this? All right. What do you need? Start creating it. Start speaking about it. Start speaking it into being. Speak to your billfold. Say, you big, thick billfold full of money. Speak to your checkbook. Say, you checkbook, you've never been so prosperous since I owned you. You're just jammed full of money. That's a direct quote. This would be something that we would laugh at if it were a parody, but it's not. This was said by someone who claims to be a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, contrast that with what the Bible actually says. Proverbs 30, verse 8 and 9. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. The culture we live in, and even some who claim to be followers of Christ, are continually bombarding us with an economic worldview that is in complete disagreement with what Jesus taught. And so in these parables, Jesus attacked the flawed thinking about money that was prevalent in his day and is still prevalent in our day. And so we're going to begin today by understanding that how we handle our money reveals our relationship with God. How you and I handle our money actually reveals our relationship with God. We cannot buy our way into a relationship with God, even with radical generosity. You cannot give it all away in order to secure a relationship with God, but a heart touched by God wants to be generous. So the first thing we need to understand about our relationship with God is that greed is evidence of an unrepentant life. Greed is evidence of an unrepentant life. Let's look at the parables. In Luke 12, it says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And then in Luke 16, it says, he also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. Then further down in Luke 16, it says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. And each of these parables deals with the sin of greed. The parable of the rich fool was told as a direct response to the greed of a person in the crowd. The shrewd manager was wasting the master's possessions. We can be certain that he wasn't wasting the money on those who were less fortunate in their community. The rich man in the third parable had multiple opportunities to help Lazarus, but he did not. In fact, if you understand the language, when it says that Lazarus wanted to be fed from what fell from the table, literally what it's talking about is they would use bread bread in those days to wipe their mouths and then discard the bread that they had used to wipe the drink and food from their mouth. It's literally saying all Lazarus wanted was the bread that they were literally using as a napkin and throwing it away. What's on display in each of these parables is greed. It's that they are living in greed, and greed is not good. Greed is sin. Greed is as much as sin as homosexuality, adultery, murder, lying, or anything else that we typically think of as sinful. Greed is evidence that our hearts are not right with God and that we are living an unrepentant life. Listen to what the Apostle Paul said about greed in Ephesians chapter 5. You can be sure that no immoral, impure, or greedy person will inherit the kingdom of Christ and of God. For a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. Don't be fooled by those who try to excuse these sins, for the anger of God will fall on all who disobey him. Did you catch what Paul said? Greed is idolatry. Greed will keep us away from Christ. Greed will lead us to judgment. So the second thing that we need to understand about our relationship with God is that selfishness is evidence of an unrepentant life. So it's not just greed that's on display, it's also selfishness. Let's look again at the parables, Luke 12. And he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. In Luke 16, it says, and the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. Then in verse 25, it says, but Abraham said, child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things, but now he is comforted here and you are in anguish. Once again, we see in all three parables that they suffered from the same disease. They are all selfish. In the parable of the rich fool, it's important to understand that he was already rich. He wasn't just trying to figure out what to do with a bumper crop. He was already wealthy. He already had barns. But when the bumper crop came in, the thought of being a blessing to others never entered his mind. All he could think to do was to selfishly hoard his money so that he could take it easy. He's also banking on the very basic economic principle of supply and demand. And you don't have to be a brilliant economist to understand supply and demand. When supply is great, then the demand is okay. But when there's no supply and there's a great demand, what happens to the price? The price goes up. If there's adequate supply, the price comes down. And so we see that this man is blessed by a bumper crop. All of these things happen. So what does that mean? It means the price of grain goes down. All of the people that need to buy grain are getting ready to be able to buy grain at a discounted price. And so what does this person do? He manipulates the markets by purposefully leaving his grain out of the market. Why? So that he can keep the price of grain high this year, and in the coming years, he's the one that has the grain. So it's not just the fact that he's got all of this, he's literally manipulating the economic systems to benefit one person himself. He's selfish. In the parable of the shrewd manager, his first thought is only about himself. He never worries about how he actually mismanaged funds from his employer. He simply says, "What shall I do now?" You say, well, how many of us are supposed to work however many hours a week, and how many hours of those week are spent on social media? Or taking off 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there. You say, well, I'm not like that shrewd manager. Are you? Nobody worries about, well, did I mismanage the funds that were coming to me? You agreed to work a certain amount of time for a certain amount of pay, and if they decide that at the end of the week they're not going to pay you what you agreed to work for, you're going to throw a fit. But if you add up all of the time that you actually spent at work that week, and if the managers were to say, well, based on the actual work that you did, you would be like, So let's not be too quick to think that these things don't apply to us. Even in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, it's implied that the rich man was selfish. Abraham told him that he had received his good things and pointed out that Lazarus had been there the whole time. And he never used his possessions to alleviate the suffering of someone less fortunate. It's not that he didn't know that Lazarus was sitting outside of his gate the whole time. It's that he didn't care. This was a guy who was looking out for number one. But how many of us suffer from the exact same sickness? How many of us are selfish? How many times do we ask, what's in it for me? Even our giving can be selfish if we're giving with an expectation that God will have to give us more. We have to realize that selfishness is evidence that our hearts are not right with God and that we are living an unrepentant life. Listen to what James, the brother of Jesus, said about selfishness in James 3. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Selfishness is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. There's no ambiguity in that statement. It's pretty powerful. The third thing we need to understand about our relationship with God is that laziness is evidence of an unrepentant life. Again, let's look at the parables. Luke 12, and he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Luke 16:3, and the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. Luke 16:19, there was a man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. All of these parables are dealing with lazy people. The rich fool's goal was to avoid work. The shrewd manager was trying to set himself up to live off of others. I'd be willing to bet that he could dig, he just didn't want to dig. The rich man in the story of Lazarus didn't seem like he worked a day in his entire life. We have to understand that work is not a bad word. God desires for us to help people who cannot help themselves, but if you can help yourself and you are expecting others to help you, you're just lazy. And laziness is sin. Laziness is evidence that our hearts are not right with God and that we are living unrepentant lives. Look at what Proverbs says about being lazy. Proverbs 15:19, a lazy person's way is blocked with briars, but the path of the upright is an open highway. Did you catch what happens in this verse? It compares the lazy with the upright. In other words, being lazy is a sign of immorality. It's not just that, well, I don't care that much for work. No, laziness is sin. So you're saying, well, does that mean I should be working 60, 80 hours a week? I'm not saying that. But there's a difference between, well, I've got a little sniffle, or I can't do this, or, I'll work really, really hard to find all of the loopholes and fill out all of the paperwork and get all of the checks, but I won't work really, really hard to just actually go get a job and keep working. That's the difference. And God doesn't bless lazy. He just never has. Why? Because it's a sign of an unrepentant life. So, in the midst of all of the shouting, we have to understand what greed, selfishness, and laziness say about our relationship with God. But what should we be doing with our money? So we understand that these things are evidence that our hearts aren't right with God. Then the question then becomes, okay, well, what do I need to do with my money? We need to use our money to store up eternal riches. That's the goal here, to use our money to store up eternal riches. Storing up eternal riches begins with being generous to God. Let's look at Luke 12, verse 21. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich or generous toward God. The idea of being rich toward God is not about giving all of our money to the church. It's not that simple. We cannot buy our way to God. There's no gatekeeper along the way that we can bribe to get to God. It doesn't work that way. Should we pay our tithes? Yes. Should we give to kingdom builders? Absolutely. There's no question about those things. However, being rich toward God is a matter of our hearts, not our income or our assets. It has nothing to do with how much we have or how much we have available to us. It is purely a condition of our hearts. Being rich or generous to God means that we've given Him complete lordship over every area in our lives. We love Him with our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. We love Him with our service, with our talents, with our thought life, with our job, with our family, and with our money. It's about wanting Jesus more than we want the next raise or our next paycheck or our next breath. That's what it means to be generous to God. So storing up eternal riches begins with being generous to God, but storing up eternal riches continues with understanding kingdom economics. It continues with understanding kingdom economics. So let's look at Luke 16. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwelling. And this has been a really difficult parable to understand. It has confused many readers because it seems like Jesus is advocating dishonesty in the matter of finances. Has anyone ever read this and been like, what in the world does that even mean? Like, I read this parable and I'm like, I've got no clue. So obviously, Jesus is not telling us to be dishonest with our money. That's not at all what he's doing. So what is going on here? This parable takes place in the culture and economic understandings of first century Palestine. That culture and that economy were built on reciprocity. Reciprocity is a concept of mutual indebtedness and mutual repayment. If you do something for me, I am then in your debt, and I am obligated to repay you in the future. So this manager knew that he would lose his job. That was clear when you read the parable. He mismanaged the funds. He is going to be out of a job. So he made quick financial decisions that would place his master's clients in his debt. So he goes to the one and he says, how much grain do you owe? And he says, this amount. He says, cut it in half. He goes to the other one. How much oil do you owe? This much. You know what? Cut that down by 40%. Why is he doing that? He's doing that because now those clients are obligated to him. They are now in his debt because as the manager, he had complete authority to speak for the owner. And the owner has to, he's out the money, but he's got to deal with it. Because he entrusted the manager made the decisions, he stuck with the decisions, but the people who benefited from the decisions are now indebted to the manager. If you read the parable, he says, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg, so I'm going to do something so that when I lose this job, they will have to welcome me into their house. That's what he says, right? This is what he's doing. He's basing this all upon the culture and the economy of that day. When I lose my job for being bad at it, these people now have to either give me a job or give me a place to stay. That's what he's saying. So he's manipulating the system. He is taking advantage of it. And he understands the financial system of the world that he lived in order to secure his future and comfort. He was using what was out there to take care of himself, and we still do this today. That's the point that Jesus is trying to make. He wasn't praising the man for being dishonest. He was trying to get you and me to understand that people of the world know how the world works. He's also trying to get us to understand that people in his kingdom should know how his kingdom works. Worldly people use their money to secure their very limited futures. We understand kingdom economics so that followers of Jesus use their money to secure others' unlimited futures. That's what Jesus is trying to get us to understand. When we understand that, we become radically generous because we want people to come to Christ. Jesus teaches this entire thing to basically say, hey, people in this world know how to make money. And the reason why they know how to use their money to get more money. Have you ever heard, hey, you got to put your money to work? Have you ever heard people that are like, you give them $100 and they can turn it into 1,000? You're like, what in the world? Because they know how the world system works. And Jesus is saying, that's how you need to be. Not greedy, not selfish, not lazy, but recognizing that I'm going to leverage my money so that other people can know Jesus. There's always been generous Christians. And this has always been the sign of genuine Christianity. The radical generosity of Christians literally reshaped the world's greatest superpower of the time and led to Western civilization as you and I know it. The Romans could not figure out these Christians. Rome actually had governmental systems in which they provided bread for the poor. But the only way that you could get that bread was if you were a man and a citizen of Rome. Christians just started taking care of everyone. They didn't care who you were or where you were from. They just started providing for everybody. They used their money to help widows and orphans, refugees and immigrants, well-connected people and slaves. And you didn't even have to be a Christian for Christians to help you. It's just how they live. That's why so many people wanted to become followers of Jesus. They had never seen anything like this before. This radical generosity literally changed the world. Hey, listen, if you like hospitals, do you know who you need to thank? You need to thank generous Christians, because hospitals were invented by and funded by generous Christians. If you like public education, thank generous Christians. Public education was invented and funded by generous Christians. If you like social and economic equality, thank generous Christians. Public education, equality, social equity, all of these things were invented and brought about by generous Christians. You say, well, that's just preacher talk. I can show you the historical documents. It's a fact. Western civilization, as we know it, was brought about by one group of people and only one group of people: generous Christians. So, if you like the concept of everyone being deserving of basic dignity, of clean food, of water, of safe living conditions, there you go. Have you ever studied where our word charity came from? Webster's dictionary defines charity as generous and helpfulness, especially toward the needy or suffering. And that sounds right. That's pretty much what we think of when we think of charity. But that's not where the word started. The word started from the Greek word agape, which means love. When the Bible was translated into Latin, the word caritas was used, and that word meant high regard, and was used because the idea of love was already being changed by the behavior of Christians and the way they treated other people. Then the term moved into Old French and took on a more practical understanding of compassion and almsgiving. Old English took the word from French, and it's centered on Christian love for others, which is why the King James in 1 Corinthians 13 says the greatest gift is charity. Then modern English took it, and we understand it as generosity to those who are in need. Christianity literally redefined the meaning of love through radical generosity in the name of Jesus. Imagine what could happen in our culture if we would live with that same kind of radical generosity. Look at what the Apostle Paul said to those of us who have money in 1 Timothy 6. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Storing up eternal riches means being generous to God and understanding kingdom economics, but it ends with understanding that our earthly money cannot be carried into eternity. Our money cannot be carried into eternity. Have you ever heard the saying that I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul? I've done a lot of funerals, and it's absolutely true. We cannot take it with us when we die. We just can't. So let's look at the parables again. Luke 12, verse 20. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Luke 16:22, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in these flames." All the grain and all the bigger barns didn't matter at all when the man in the parable died. All of the opulence that the rich man lived with didn't help him in eternity. Jesus makes this perfectly clear in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. He says, "Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So generosity is evidence of a heart that has been transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we say a heart touched by God wants to be generous. Our relationship with money will reveal the truth about our relationship with God. And I know that people don't like it when we talk about money. But friends, this is the truth. Our relationship with money will reveal the truth about our relationship with God. We need to not think like the world does, but we need to be intentional about storing up eternal riches.